Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our program that is sponsored by the Economic Development Committee. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to our guests. Thank you to our speakers and our participants. First, I'd like to introduce you to our president of Lancaster Branch NAACP, Blanding Watson. Blanding?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you and welcome to our program this evening. We honor our ancestors of the Tulsa Massacre of 1921, and we thank our speaker for being with us on this evening. I hope that everyone enjoys what we have to bring forth um, as a message today relevant to economic injustices that we continue to experience even in 2021. Um, Before we start, I also wanted to share with you a little bit of etiquette. At the end of the program today, you will have an opportunity to ask questions, and please put your questions in the chat box. And we're also aware of any Zoom bombing that may exist as well. And if that should happen, we will address this and take care of that as soon as possible. Again, we thank everyone, our participants, for being on with us today, and the ones that are joining us with Facebook Live and or any other social media platforms. With that being said, I will transition everything back to our economic chair, Elizabeth Guthridge. Again, thank you, everyone, and I look forward to being a part of our program today.
Thank you, President Watson. Thank you. I appreciate that introduction. Lancaster's NAACP Economic Development Committee, we strive to inform, educate our community on all things economic development. We take our charge from the national NAACP, and there are wealth building activities that is centered around their six strategic pillars or game changers. Um, the Economic Development Committee honors the events and the people from 1921 Tulsa, Oklahoma race massacre. And that is where a mob of white Oklahomans burned Tulsa, Greenwood district, which was founded and built by Black residents in a city that was heavily segregated by the Jim Crow laws. And it was flourishing, and it was a self-sustaining business district. It was considered to be the wealthiest Black community in US. Today, there continues to be documented disparity between white and Black people in this country regarding wealth or net worth. White families have 8 to 10 times the net worth on an average of Black families. And there have been systematic obstacles to creation of generational wealth for Black people. For example, redlining. Redlining is a perfect example. And that is a practice where the banks refuse to offer mortgage loans to people who lived in areas that deemed to be poor or that deemed to be a financial risk. And let's just face it, that limited Black people or people of color to to achieving economic wealth. And let's just face it again, home ownership is that gateway to economic wealth. And so going back to the Tulsa Race Massacre, not only did that destroy Black wealth in Tulsa, Oklahoma, it also resulted in 300 deaths. And so by the end of our message today, we'd like to focus on 2 points. The first being that we have to face this history because history teaches us how we arrived at this point where Black families net worth significantly more than white families more than Black families. And we also have to constantly work to remedy this situation of economic empowerment. So I just want to say those few things before we get started. And if you don't mind, can we just take a moment to bow our heads in silence? Can we do that just for a moment? So let's do that now. Okay, thank you. Just want to just take a moment, um, just to show our gratefulness for our ancestors that came before us, who had that vision, that we should be looking at that as a life lesson. Um, so, our event this evening seeks to increase knowledge and understanding about the economic challenges that we have in our Black communities. So, I am going to introduce you to our moderator, and she is going to make sure that if there's any questions, she will make sure that our speaker answer them. Okay, so Teresa Bailey is the founder of Women of Color Luncheon. She works as a clerk for the city of Lancaster since 2012. Teresa is a graduate of our local high school, J.P. McCaskey, in 2004, as well as having a bachelor's in criminal justice from Keystone College. She's a member of Bethel AME Church, and she is a member of Ladies of Actions, Big Brothers and Sisters of Lancaster County, and she has volunteered in many, many United Way activities. She's been recognized by the city for her efforts organizing the city's very first Women of Color brunch in 2019. And without further ado, Teresa, can you unmute yourself? Thank you.
Hello.
Take it from here.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. Thanks again for joining us. Again, as she said, my name is Teresa Bailey. I will be our moderator for today, and I would actually like to introduce our speaker. His name is Bishop Dwayne Royster, a native of Philadelphia. Yay. He has been working and I apologize here, for the past 26 years, been working in ministry. He is currently serves as a senior pastor of Faith United Church of Christ in Washington, D.C. He's also done numerous, I apologize, has a extensive organizing, advocacy, political, and faith leadership experience. And he also serves as the founder of the Society for Faith and Justice, and I'm sorry, I'm butchering it. Religious order committed to a charism of social justice as a spiritual discipline and spiritual practice. Bishop also is I believe one of the he works in the power. I forgot what the acronym is for. But before I butcher any more information, Bishop Royster, would you please introduce yourself?
Great. Thank you so much to President Blanding, to Chairperson Guthridge, to Sister Bailey. Appreciate each and every one of you for extending the invitation. And Sister Bailey, don't worry, we're changing the name. It used to be an acronym. It's not going to be an acronym anymore. It's just going to be Power Interfaith. So we are okay. So don't worry about the acronym because we don't really use that anymore. I'm really excited and glad to be back here with the Lancaster, Pennsylvania NAACP chapter. So deeply appreciate your work and partnership as you partner with Power Lancaster on a variety of initiatives, both economic and around criminal justice reform in the city of Lancaster and Lancaster County area. It's a deep moment today One of the things that I do is I'm actually a radio show host in Philadelphia at Word Radio, which is the only independently owned Black station in the state of Pennsylvania. I'm a talk show host. The Reverend Dr. Mark Kelly Tyler and myself co-host a show every morning at 6 a.m. Monday through Friday called the Power Hour. And this morning, we actually had a person on Reverend Tyler's staff at Mother Bethel who is a direct descendant of survivors of the Tulsa Massacre. And I want to be careful to not use riot, because I learned today from Reverend Marcia Williams that they called it a riot so that the insurance companies did not have to pay out to the families that lost their property. So it was really a massacre when you consider that 35 square blocks were taken out and that 10,000 people were displaced as a result of bombs and incendiary devices and guns and bullets and white supremacist mobs were attacking this community. It was a straight out massacre. It was not intended to be anything other than that. And so we come at this moment, this very solemn moment, and to say 100 years later is a very frustrating moment that we're continuing to dig into, because the estimated value of Greenwood section of Tulsa was in that day probably worth about $35 million in today's dollars. So when you consider the economic impact that this has on our communities, it's deeply discouraging. But I would, if for a few moments, we might be able to turn to a bit of sacred text. And I just want to acknowledge that I recognize everybody here is not a Christian, and we certainly want to respect all traditions that are out there. So take this in whatever vantage point you need to be able to look at it. But I just want to look at a story in the sacred text. In particular, this is in the Gospel of Luke, the good news as proclaimed to us by the Apostle Luke. And this is a story that might not on the surface seem like it speaks to this issue, but in reality really does. So I wonder if you would just delve with me. Luke 19, in verse 1, it says, he entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man was there named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd, he could not, because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him, because he was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. All who saw it began to grumble and said, he has gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner. Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much. I want to focus, though, on the sycamore tree. I just want to focus on the sycamore tree for just a few moments. Would you indulge me just in a moment as I do a centering prayer to prepare to bring forth this message today? Holy One, we thank you for this moment in time to be able to come and share forth a word that we believe will speak life, speak hope, speak opportunity, even in the midst of sometimes what appears to be a very dark and dangerous world. We come at this moment and hour asking, oh God, that you would just come, thunder in the ears of your people, speak truth and life to each and every one of them, speak to them in the various places that they find themselves. Loose them, God, to be used of you and to be used to bless their community in ways that they could not even begin to think or imagine. Now, God, I pray that you remove everything from me that's not like you. Fill me with your spirit, oh God, and cover me in the blood of the Lamb, that every spot, wrinkle, or blemish is cast away. And then, God, for everyone under the sound of my voice, may they hear, see, taste, understand, and speak forth an understanding of your will in this world. This, God, we pray in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. 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 So, beloved, again, understanding everybody is not a Christian in this place, and I certainly want to respect that. But I was looking at this story, and this was a very interesting story to me because it's a story of a tax collector, somebody that is deeply aligned with empire, who actually had betrayed his own community and was really making money and enjoying the profits off of what he was doing. But there was this guy named Jesus in town. Everybody wanted to see Jesus. They heard about the miracles. They heard about turning water into wine. Jesus was healing the sick, raising the dead. And so Zacchaeus, the tax collector, who was the chief tax collector in a city called Jericho, because he was short, the Bible says that he ran up into a sycamore tree so that he could see Jesus coming down the road. The story goes on to say that eventually Jesus saw Zacchaeus up in the sycamore tree, eventually said to Zacchaeus, "Come down, I'm eating at your house today." Folk were upset that Zacchaeus was going to eat with Jesus. And eventually, after having his encounter with Jesus, he decides to give away half his possessions and pay back anybody he had defrauded 4 times the amount that he had originally taken from them in the first place. But the interesting thing in the midst of all of this is this notion of the sycamore tree. And in ancient Israel, a sycamore tree is also known as a fig tree. And I think that this is important for us to understand because the fig tree is primarily found in Africa. It is not native to this particular region of the Middle East, but had been exported over into Israel and to Lebanon and Syria and other countries. And so it was found to grow well in some localized settings. So it found to grow well in Jericho. It didn't grow well in every community, but it began to grow well in some places in Israel and in Palestine and some places in Egypt. And it grew well in Jericho. Now, this tree was not just a tree that was important because it was a tree, but it was important because it was also an economic engine for the city of Jericho and other places. As a matter of fact, figs were a big commodity in Israel. It was a way for people to be able to make money. It was an important tree. As a matter of fact, we find writings about the fig tree in both the Hebrew Bible, also known as the Old Testament. We find writings about the fig tree in the Gospel, and in the Jewish Talmud, we find writings about the fig tree as well because it produced money. As a matter of fact, it was so important that at certain times King David sent officers and security folk to overlook the fig trees to make sure that nothing happened to it because it was driving the engine of Israel so much so. The fig tree is even more important. Watch this, because in some African religions, particular to those in central Kenya, the sycamore is considered a sacred tree. As a matter of fact, all sacrifices to the supreme creator were made under the sycamore tree. And if the sycamore tree, also called the magumo tree, fell, it would symbolize a bad omen, and rituals had to be performed by the elders of the society to get rid of the bad omens and basically the evil that would come upon the community. When I think about what happened in Tulsa, when I think about the fact that there were displaced Africans that decided to take root in a place called Tulsa, Oklahoma, after having an experience of watching others build community, that they went into a place called the Greenwood District, created the Greenwood District, and began to lay down a foundation, so much so that there were blocks and blocks and blocks of African Americans, African descendants of slaves, Africans that were still coming over into the country that were located in this place. And because Tulsa, Oklahoma was a white supremacist, white nationalist community that had created laws that forced separation between the white community and the Black community, and basically said you could not buy, sell, or trade or do anything with anybody of another race inside the community, that that African Americans created their own community and created great levels of wealth. There were Black doctors, there were Black clergy, there were Black lawyers, there were Black community and civic leaders, there were Black businesses, there were all sorts of Black things that you could imagine, and everybody was living together in the Greenwood District. But see, here's the thing that comes along, and this is how white supremacy manifests itself. Sometimes when folk are trying to get from one level to the next level, they think that they can step on anything that allows them to get an edge up or to step up into something else. So just like Zacchaeus stepped on the sycamore tree to be able to get to the next level, we have to recognize that sometimes folk are willing to step on Black folk, willing to step on African folk, willing to step on whomever whomever they want to so that they can get to the next level and try to be able to be seen and to be heard and to be valued in society. Oh my God, let me come on with this for a minute. Let me just speak truth here for a minute. There are even those in the Christian faith that would rather align themselves with empire and white supremacy than align themselves with their siblings in Christ, their siblings who are created in the image and likeness of God for the sake of being able to get ahead. But here's something that we have to understand. At some point, people will be confronted with truth. And in this particular story, Jesus represents truth. Jesus was able to reflect back onto Zacchaeus everything that he did wrong, everything that he was not supposed to be. And Jesus didn't even really have to say anything to him other than, I'm coming to your house tonight. And so Zacchaeus, when he got there, before Jesus could even begin talking with him, said, I'm going to give half of everything I have to the poor. I'm going to give back 4 times the amount of money that I have taken from people illegally and illicitly. I'm going to give them back that money 4 times so that there was a transfer of wealth from the 1% to the 99%. You all missed that one. Let me go back and hit that again. There was a transfer of wealth because they were confronting truth and about the fact that he made his money illegally. There was a transfer from wealth from the 1% to the 99%. And that transfer of wealth was done in such a way that the people in Jericho would be able to live and survive and thrive in their communities. So here's the challenge that we have today, brothers and sisters, when we are looking at the issue of Tulsa and the Tulsa race massacre. And let me be clear, as I said earlier, I'm not going to refer to it as a riot because they're insurance companies, and we need to find some of those insurance companies and hold them accountable now for what they didn't do back 100 years ago and make sure that they pay out claims. But when we get to this point, we now have to say to all the folk in Oklahoma, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, to the mayor and to the business leaders, the folk that made money off of the massacre. Let me just say that again. There were folk that made money off of the massacre. Why? Because when the black businesses died and when they were gone, the black business leaders were gone, folk had to go buy stuff somewhere. They needed to be able to go access something somewhere. There were job opportunities that were created for more white folk in that particular moment as a result of the fact that black businesses and black families were moving out of the community. Folk were making money off the misery of black bodies. Let me say that again. It wasn't that they were just making money off of black bodies. They were making money off the misery of black bodies. Burnt black bodies, dead black bodies, injured black bodies, burnt down black homes. They were burnt down black businesses. They were making money off of those businesses. Now, here's the thing. Let me just be clear about this. Somebody owes some folks some money. Let me just say that very clearly. And so the folk in Tulsa and the folk that have benefited in Oklahoma owe the descendants of the survivors of Tulsa, they owe them reparations. They owe them money. The businesses that were there owe them money. They owe them for that. If they can make money off of the tragedy, they can certainly pay money off of the tragedy too. Hello, somebody. They can pay somebody to be able to have the resources that they need in this particular moment in time. There were other communities across the country that looked like Tulsa, and there were other massacres that occurred in places where black wealth began to accumulate. And so what we also understand from this is that there is a fear of black wealth. Just like there's a fear of black intelligence, there's a fear of black wealth. And if I'm going to be real with you, the whole reason the Tulsa Massacre started is a fear of black sexuality, right? Because a brother who was the shoe shine man on the community went into a store to go to the top level to use the bathroom. Now watch this. Because it was the only bathroom they would let him use downtown, he went into the elevator, tripped, grabbed the hand of the woman that was the elevator operator, because we need to understand this too. Back then, they had people operating the elevators. Somehow or another, something happened. There's a whole bunch of stories about what happened here. Nevertheless, He didn't do anything to her, but people have accused him of doing stuff to her. And it was a fear of a Black man's sexuality. So we fear Black sexuality, we fear Black in excellence, we fear Black economic wealth, we fear all these things. However, the beauty about Black folk is that you might kick us and we might appear to be down for a moment, but one way or another, we will get up, we will rise up, and our truth will be spoken. Somebody will begin to acknowledge our truth. It might take 100 years. It might take hundreds of years, but God is not going to let this continue to happen without eventually turning it around so that people have to bless the families that have suffered through this. Just 2 weeks ago, a 107-year-old survivor from the Tulsa Massacre testified before Congress. And she told her story. And she told the story about everything that she lost, her education. She lost parts of her family. She lost the opportunity to grow up in a community where she felt safe. And for the rest of her life, she would experience over and over again the trauma of being a 7-year-old and watching her community be slaughtered, her home be burned down. And she would forever live in the fear that this could happen again. God is not going to let this continue in this way. And it's my supposition that when we think about the issue of economics, that we have to talk about the issue of reparations. That when we take a look at this, God is not going to let people continue to take the blessing and bounty of Africa and use it and misuse it in ways, regardless of where it's located in the world, and that eventually we will get back that which was stolen and taken from us. It is my belief in this moment, in this hour, we need H.R. 40 passed in the U.S. Congress. H.R. 40 and SB 40 are the Senate bills and the House bills that are putting forth a campaign to study reparations in this country. We need to make sure that we are doing everything we can to support the education of our young Black children right now. If we want to talk about an economic engine, we've got to support education and make sure that every Black child gets the best quality education possible. And that because they are the descendants of slaves, their ancestors suffered at the hand of white supremacy in this country, that they are able to get the education they need to be able to thrive, that money is released at the federal level, the state level, and local and county levels to be able to support the development of Black businesses and to be able to set those businesses free so that we don't continually have people stepping on the sycamore tree so that they can continue to prosper and not make sure that they're going to give back to the community that they have taken from and stolen from so deeply. I'm going to stop right there and just share this story, but I just want to say that although we might be sycamore trees, we are big trees, 20 meters tall and wide, and can feed a whole community and cause an economy to thrive. And that God has gifted us the ability to be able to do these things. So as we think about Tulsa, we need to remember Tulsa. We need to remember the lessons that we learned from Tulsa. And we need to make sure that we continue to build Black business, Black economic power, Black opportunities for our children so that our communities can continue to thrive and pick up where Tulsa, the Greenwood community in Tulsa, left off. God bless you, family, and thank you for letting me come and share today.
All right. Thank you so much for that amazing allergy. I can't speak today. But if anybody has any questions at all, please let us know. We're going to have like a nice little Q&A section with Bishop. First, I'd like to ask more about your Power Hour, Bishop. If you could please let those who are watching and listening know what channel they can listen on.
Sure.
And things of that nature.
Sure. So Word Radio is on 96.1 FM, 900 AM in Philadelphia in the Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware area. You're actually on the eastern side of the state. You can actually get it. But we're also on YouTube, Facebook every morning. On WURD Radio, WURD's Word Radio. It's not a religious station, it's a secular station, it's a Black talk station, but we're on every morning at 6 a.m. You can join us just by going to WURD radio. And if you have an Alexa, you can say, Alexa, give me WURD radio, and it will bring it up, and you can listen to the show that way. I know that's early in the morning, but every morning we're talking about these very issues that I'm sharing tonight. We're talking about this on the radio first thing every morning, Monday through Friday. So thank you for letting me share about that. That's an important part of my ongoing ministry and the work that I do with Power, and really trying to create social justice opportunities and changing the narrative around issues in the state of Pennsylvania.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Also, I did kind of have a couple of questions about maybe your take on it. So for those people who do know, or for those who don't know, Tulsa isn't the only place that they burned to the ground. Tulsa's a part of the Red Summer, where they burned down at least 20 or leveled at least 26 cities, and more. Please explain, because it's still kind of happening today. There are certain places and certain areas where are being removed, and it seems like those areas are Black, are mostly with African American residents. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, even if we go back to the uprising that occurred last summer, when major cities across the country basically forced protesters and those that were resisting the police state back into African American communities. One of the interesting things that happened was that those communities, many of them burned up, and a lot of people were blaming Black folk for that. That was not Black folk that was burning down those communities. We were not burning up the stores. Now, admittedly, some folk were looting the stores after somebody broke into them and started to burn them, but we were not the ones that were generating that. There were white folk that were actually causing this problem. And not to be a conspiracy theorist, but I do know this for a fact, at least for Philadelphia, there were actually white supremacists that were in those crowds intentionally doing that damage. And causing problems in our community. Philadelphia went up twice last year, not just after George Floyd was killed, but we had a similar killing in right before the election in November. It was at the end of October, of Walter Wallace. And we had the protest all over again. And it was forced into West Philly, right along 52nd Street. Anybody knows 52nd Street in Philadelphia? It's a big area of Black businesses that are there, that's been there for a very long period of time. And those businesses were forced to shut down. They were broken into. And you can see very clearly that there was a destruction done by white folk. It was not done by Black folk that were doing that. It was anarchists who were white folk that were coming into Black communities and do that. And, the police didn't try to stop them. They certainly were trying to prevent them from doing damage in Center City, Philadelphia, and in center cities across the country, but they were not trying to stop them from doing the damage that they were doing in Black communities. So this continues to perpetuate itself today in cities all across the country. When Black folk are beginning to protest and rise up, they'll let our communities burn, but they will not. They will do everything they can to protect white businesses in the center city area and lock down those areas and prevent people from being able to use their First Amendment right to protest.
Thanks so much. I did have another question, but it kind of went out of my head a little bit there. So someone wants to know, is there any group, commission, or entity that's working on some kind of process to assess the amount of reparations, and how will they be paid out?
So there's been rumors about this commission. There's a commission that's done work around Tulsa and in Oklahoma, and commemorates this day. There's been a push around pushing towards reparations. I don't know if anybody's trying to figure it out. I mean, the value of Tulsa in 2021 dollars was about $35 million worth of damage. Now, but let me just say that we need to compound that over 100 years of lack of investment and interest and other things. So, I mean, honestly, this probably is a $500 million, $750 million worth of disinvestment that happened and loss of revenue that occurred. But I don't know for sure who's handling that aspect of it and trying to figure that out. Because I think if all we do is give people back the money that they lost, we've done a disservice and we've dishonored the memory and the legacy of what was Black excellence and Black wealth building in the Greenwood district.
Thank you. And that was Lisa. Thank you so much, Lisa, for that amazing question. Really appreciate that. Um, also, so with everything that's going on now with the Congress and of trying to get those descendants paid, what about I'm gonna say it, the 40 acres and a mule. So how are we going to, do you believe that we'll actually get to that at one point?
Well, I don't think it's actually going to be 40 acres and a mule. I mean, let me just say that HR 40, which has been introduced in every Congress for about 25 years, for a very long period of time. This last time it was introduced by Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee of Texas. It has been introduced over and over again. And we want to be very clear that the bill is about the study of reparations. It's not about reparations itself. It's just about the study of reparations, which I find very interesting that Congress doesn't even want to study the issue. The House does. The Senate leaves a lot to be seen. But we need to be able to study this issue to determine what we need to see in terms of reparations. But again, 40 acres and a mule is not enough. We need 40 acres and a mule plus daily compounded interest on top of that. So I think we need to, make sure that we're getting everything that we lost, because the businesses that have oppressed us have continued to daily add to their interest and make more money on top of us. Then we need to make sure that we are doing everything we can to reclaim all the interest and all the dollars that we lost over those decades.
Thank you. So someone had a question. They want to know with whom could we work with to look into these types of issues to see how to work towards, healing of, these tragic events such as
Yeah.
what happened 100 years ago with Tulsa.
Yeah, it's actually interesting. Power is actually working on this right now. We're beginning to create healing spaces, because it's not enough just to be angry and traumatized. We've got to work towards healing is a part of the resistance, right? Being made whole is part of the resistance. And so we are working on this. There are various other organizations that are popping up and have been around that are addressing the healing spaces as well. Actually, Black Lives Matter is doing that. Other organizations that are coming along, are really, really important. We do need more Black therapists. I see Chairperson Guthridge put that in there, that we do. And actually, in some parts of the state, I don't know so much about Lancaster, but I do know for the the southeast part of the state, there's actually been a coalition of Black therapists that have gotten together that have put out their services for Black folk. And what's wonderful about this is that many of them are so booked up right now. We actually need more Black therapists to help folk out and in this particular moment in this trauma. But I think it's also incumbent upon communities of faith to figure out ways that we can. I mean, and certainly we have our Sunday worships or our Friday worship services, Saturday worship service, all depending on our various faith traditions that we gather. But I think we need to be leaning in more and dealing specifically with Black trauma and how this is deeply affecting our community and how it affects each generation differently as well. I'm of a certain age at this point in my life, and how it affects me is different than how it affects my millennial daughter or my Gen Z daughter. Since I'm a Gen Xer, and it's impact differently on my parents who are baby boomers. So, we have to also deeply understand how each generation is dealing with the mental and emotional impacts of all these things and be able to speak to their needs right where they are.
Do you have like, is there a specific like name or group or organization that these Black therapists are in? Can we will Is there a space where more Black therapists can join this group? Is there something online that people can go to and things like that?
Yeah, I actually don't have that right here in front of me. I mean, I would be glad to send it to you after this. Unfortunately, I can't give you the answer to that right now, but I actually know some of the therapists that are part of this movement space and creating these spaces for folk to do healing work. So I would be glad to get back to you, and you could share with the folk that are watching here. We could probably just put in the feed somewhere down the road for folk to be able to access that information. We'd be glad to share that. And also to share too, Power actually tomorrow night is actually doing a healing service that is happening tomorrow, I believe at 6 or 7 p.m. And you can go to powerinterfaith.org. It's online service, but it's designed primarily to deal with the healing around racial trauma and the trauma of COVID-19, which actually you can't talk about COVID-19 and not talk about racial injustice at the same time. In the way that unduly impacted the African American community. So we would certainly invite folk that are interested to go to powerinterfaith.org. You can actually log on and go to our calendar, and it'll have the service listed, the healing service listed there. And feel free to join us tomorrow night for that healing service. And I saw Chairperson Guthridge's question about Dr. Claude Alexander. If I believe Dr. Claude Anderson. I am not as familiar with Dr. Anderson, but now you've stoked my interest. So I'm going to go do some more research.
Can I briefly speak about him, Teresa? Okay, Dr. Boyce Watkins and Dr. Claude Anderson, they talk about two things to help in this healing process. One, we should write our own stories. Two, we should educate our own children. And three, we should create our own economic system. And having said all that, Dr. Claude Anderson, he wrote a book called Power Economics. I thought that would make a good play on your organization. But Power Economics, and his whole life work is to talk about, promote, educate, advice, all about reparations. So if you want to start, uh, an education, not just that HB 40, which I'm going to look into that, but to really look into this gentleman because his whole life's work, we're talking about decades of work. And he did this all black conference in Philly about 4 years ago. And I was totally impressed with the work that he's doing for reparation. I thought I would pass that on, Pastor.
Thank you. Thank you. I look forward to getting that information.
Thank you. So we had someone post, I believe it's an MSNBC link for what the mayor of Tulsa had to say about
Yeah, reparations to Tiffany
yeah,
Cross. Yeah.
yes. So for those of you who are watching, once this is over, definitely please click that link. It's definitely some interesting things to listen to. What has happened 100 years ago definitely is something that we really need to make sure that we teach our kids about. That is definitely something that we need to speak with others about because a lot of people really don't know about what happened, and other people are definitely saying that it's being done on purpose to kind of erase what has happened to us. But we definitely, as a country, really need to take a look at that mirror and see who we are as ourselves and kind of start that healing process. So thank you so much, Bishop.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
May I add another comment, Teresa, if that's okay? Thank you. One thing that was really about your story, it threw me for a loop, and I was just waiting for the other shoe to drop. You know, so I appreciate the way you laid that out for us. And I didn't know where that was going, but that was really excellent because we needed to hear um, just how easy it is to step on a group of people,
Hmm.
just
Hmm.
how easy it is. And the other question I had for you about just that, I think part of the problem with us not unifying with this reparations is because we hadn't acknowledged the truth as a community. We truly, not some of us, but we all need to acknowledge this is what happened to us.
Yeah.
And and if you could, and I don't know all the facts, but if you can clarify, is this piece of legislation, and I know I'm gonna chop it up, that's saying that they don't want people to teach about
Yeah.
uh,
Mhm.
anti-racism to make them feel bad. Can you help us understand that?
Yeah, so there was an introduction of critical race theory, in which is a thought that we have to really go back and read that the way the American history has been laid out, it does not do an analysis of race, and that you can't do a study of American history and not include race. And so it's called critical race theory, right? Which basically says you have to talk about the impact of racism, white supremacy, slavery on the shaping of this country. So there are folks, in particular, a lot of folk in the South and other folk, white supremacists in general, white nationalists, that don't want to have this conversation because they don't want to look like their families are evil in the sight of their children. And so a lot of, and in particular, a lot of this began in earnest around the 1619 project that was written about in the New York Times. And some of you know that the author of that actually was teaching at the University of North Carolina, and they did not want to give her tenure because of that. There were groups of people complaining about critical race theory and about what they considered a revisionist history of the United States history. Well, slavery happened, white supremacy happened. The perpetuation of Jim Crow happened. Jim Crow Esquire continues to happen in this country right now. So it's not revisionist. It's just that you all have chosen to exclude that from in a deep study. And there are folk that are saying, no, you've got to study that in earnest if you really want to be able to understand America. And so school districts across the country are basically throwing out materials. Their school boards are voting to throw out materials that include anything that references critical race theory or uses critical race theory as a way to address American history or sociology or any other topic. And there are colleges and religious denominations that are having troubles with critical race theory as well. And part of those institutions are having trouble because many of them are on the wrong side of history on the issue of race. And they don't want to be seen wrong in the light of those that are studying critical race history theory. Because if you go back and look at critical race theory, it's a very clear delineation. Either you were for Black people or you were against Black people. And we just need to call a spade and lay it out there. I mean, I hate to say it like that, but just call it what it is, and be able to speak to that. And so that we can just have a real understanding of that. Look, we can't go back and change history. We can't go back and change it. We can make up for it and attempt to make up for it and apologize for it, but we can't change history. So let's speak the truth about our history so that we are not destined to repeat it over and over and over again. Even as we're talking about Tulsa right now, let's not let this ever happen again, in this way.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. Thank you so much for everything and for joining us today. So we got about 10 minutes left. Does anybody have any questions? Does anybody have anything at all?
Another question in the chat. What should we be telling our children? This is very, very difficult. Very, very difficult. Um, Bishop, if you can indulge with me a second, I
Yeah.
remember during the pandemic, the children were staying home. And I
Mhm.
remember during the election, my grandson is in the sixth grade. They were asking each other, they're all in sixth grade, who are you voting for? Who do you vote? And this is not about politics, it's about uh,
Right.
race. And so they're in sixth grade. Six or eight kids started talking back and forth. Who you voting for? Who you voting for? And it got so hostile that the Spanish teacher said, hold up. First of all, none of y'all old enough to vote.
Right.
But the point was they were so opinionated.
Mhm.
And my grandson said, well, I'm not voting for the other guy because he doesn't like Black people.
Mhm.
So I'm like, whoops, I maybe should mute this. But to hear sixth graders talk like that, what should we be telling our children? Because they're in pain. They hear this, they don't know what to think. He's a Black boy. What should we be telling our children about this subject?
I think you got to tell them the truth. There were children that were maimed and injured in the Tulsa Massacre. There were, and this is really hard because a lot of folk, I mean, I one of our sister organizations in New Hampshire. New Hampshire is not known for being, it's known for being a very white state, but in our work in Manchester, we had a high school. We were working with young people in a high school up there, organizing them, and their school board, one of their school board members was upset because he did not want his daughter, who was in elementary school, to learn about slavery
Oh, yeah.
because he said it was offensive to her sensibilities. And I actually had a chance to have a conversation with him at one point, and I said, "Why are you afraid of your daughter learning about these children that were enslaved, but you're not concerned about the children that were enslaved at the same age that your daughter is right now?" So I think we have to tell our children the truth in a language, in a way that speaks to their age group, right? I'm not saying you lay it all out for them, but I think we have to tell this. We have to tell history, right? We've got to tell them the truth about Tulsa. We've got to tell them the truth about other massacres that have occurred across this country. We got to tell them the truth about Jim Crow, right, and lynchings and all those things that have happened when it's the appropriate age for them. But I think we have to tell them the truth. We cannot allow them to live in this sort of utopian notion of America that just doesn't exist. We need to speak the truth to them and help them to understand it. And I know for some people that might be very upsetting, especially educators out there. I'm sorry, I don't mean to step on your toes, but from my estimation, the Bible says, "Know the truth, and the truth will set you free."
Yes, sir.
And I want to make sure that our children are set free and they're not caught up in some world imagining something and they're feeling things, but they don't have words for it because we've never taught them the truth.
Thank you.
Mhm.
We do have another question.
Yes. The question is, what kind of study might be done with church participants across all denominations to create this discussion that leads to affirmation, acceptance, as well as inclusion?
Yeah, I mean, I think, part of this is we can't get to the kumbaya moment until we're willing to dig out the wound, the festering wound that is. In one of the denominations I belong to, the United Church of Christ, our general minister and president wrote actually a whole piece about white privilege and white supremacy to use in white churches in the denomination to begin to address this issue. And I think that that is an important piece that we have to address. We have to have some real honest conversations, right? We can't get. I'm beyond the place of having a kumbaya conversation when you can smell the festering wound behind it,
Mhm.
right? You can't. You got to clean out the wound first, right? And we got to go in there and let me just be graphic for a minute, right? We got to dig off the scab, dig out the pus, get down to the place where it's deeply infected, and then we can begin to apply some antibiotics and put some other medicine in there to begin to heal it. But first you got to dig it out first, and you got to get the wound clean. And so part of the cleansing process to the wound is speaking truth. It is getting not just black folk but white folk to acknowledge that this is what happened, this is real. They acknowledge that our country and our society is built off a notion of white supremacy, and that it's not just white privilege, it's white supremacy, right? And that there's deep aspects of that we just have to own and talk about and be able to address. And that the way society is structured, it is always structured to benefit white folk to some extent. But we also need to tell the truth that there are ways in which the 1% white folk use middle class and working class and impoverished white folk as a shield against middle class and working class and impoverished black and brown folk in this country, and that we actually have more in common with each other than they do with the 1%. And that we can begin to see our common shared self-interest, and that if we would align ourselves together, we could actually make the changes and the transformation that we need in our society and come against this unfettered capitalism and this deep sense of oligarchy that ultimately is designed to put its foot on the neck of anybody who doesn't meet the oligarch standards. And so I think we need to really have that serious, deep conversation, and faith communities are spaces where we need to be able to have honest conversation. If you have aught with your brother or sister, go to them one to one. If that doesn't work, take 2 or 3 members of the church. And if that doesn't work, you go to the elders of the church. Well, the elders of the church need to step up right now. Denominational leaders, congregational leaders, they need to step up right now and say to themselves and their congregations, we've got issues. And we've got to face those issues that are hurting not only our neighbor, but also hurting us at the same time, and begin to have those conversations. And some of those conversations just need to be white folk with white folk, no black folk in the room,
That's right.
where they can have that conversation amongst themselves. And then after they've begun that process, then we can all come back to the table together again and begin to think about what we need to do to move forward.
Right. We also have another, I'm not sure if this is a question or a comment, but someone is definitely with us about teaching our young ones. And they said, wonder if it is American enslavement that's the issue. To talk about ancient enslavement, parents are fine with it, but they talk about the Holocaust.
Yeah. I mean, I think we have a problem talking about oppression, period, in whatever form that it takes. And I mean, we need to talk about the notion of American chattel slavery being a unique slavery in history, right? But we can look at the Holocaust and see not only the Holocaust that occurred of our Jewish siblings, but we can also then go back to the deep massacre and the genocide that occurred of indigenous peoples in this country, and the deep genocide that occurred of Africans lost in the Middle Passage, right? But we have a hard time talking about, we don't want to talk about any of those things. You know, we dedicate a week or maybe a couple of days in the social studies class to teach our kids about it, and that's about it. And so we're not having a conversation about oppression and how white supremacy is pretty much manifest in most of it. And so at least in the modern age, we're not really having serious conversations about how it's manifesting itself, whether it is the Middle Passage, whether it has to do with the genocide of the indigenous populations in this country, whether it has to do with the Holocaust that occurred over in Germany, or whether we're talking about slavery, Jim Crow, and James Crow Esquire that continue to manifest itself here in the United States.
Mhm.
Really quickly, would you like to, because we got about 5 minutes left,
Sure.
would you explain to people a little bit more about the Middle Passage and the Igbo tribe?
Yeah, so I mean, the Igbo in particular, not so much sure about, but the Middle Passage was actually the passage of that the slavers took from African, the coast of Africa, and brought into Europe and the United States. So we have to remember, slavery did not start in America; it actually started in Europe, right? And slavery was a tradition that was brought to America. It's just that Americans took it to a whole nother level. And I think that we need to have that real honest conversation, right? European slavery did not necessarily look the same way that slavery did here in the United States and in the Caribbean, and actually ventured down even into South America eventually. So we need to have a very clear understanding. But there was over 1.5 million people that were lost in the waters of the Atlantic in the Middle Passage. Slave ships throwing them overboard, trying to hide what they were doing, people that died because of treatment on the ships, women that were raped and tortured and beaten, men that were brutalized and attacked both sexually and physically on those ships, right? There was massive damage and trauma that was inflicted upon numerous generations of Africans that were enslaved coming over from Africa to the United States and to Europe. Eventually, Europe outlawed slavery long before the United States did. But there were a lot of folk that were lost in the Middle Passage that brought those slaves over to America. We don't often talk about the Middle Passage. Some black folk talk about the Middle Passage, but we don't really do a good job studying the history of the Middle Passage. And so that when we talk about a genocide and a Holocaust, we have to include the Middle Passage as a part of that journey as well. And so I think we need to make sure that we recognize that too, that was a truth that has been lost, that we do not have a deep conversation about. And let me just say this, right, because this piece is also about economics, right? You can't have a conversation about American history and not talk about the economics of the Black body, right? And that the Black body was capitalized And it was the economic engine that drove this country. Some people said cotton was king. It actually wasn't that cotton was king. It was the slaves that were picking the cotton
That's
that
correct.
were actually generating the economy in this country. So we can't really, again, going back to critical race theory, you can't have a conversation in this country about America if you are not willing to have a deep conversation about how racism, white supremacy manifested itself in this country. And I'm going to go back to something Sister Guthridge had put into the chat just a minute ago. I just spoke recently about was at an action that was held down in Washington D.C. about the statehood for Washington D.C. And I actually was a keynote speaker, and part of my message was fear of a black state. Because it would actually be the first majority black state in the union if it came into existence. And the interesting thing is that Washington, D.C. has the highest gross domestic product of any state in the country. It would also has the highest education level of any state in the country, and it's 49% black. So let me just think about that for a minute. Highest GDP, highest education level. There were a whole bunch of areas that were very high in the state of Washington, D.C. I mean, well, it will hopefully be a state one of these days. We're still trying to get there. But part of the challenge was, and going back, it was they were on the day that we did the action, and I'm forgetting the name of the day now, Emancipation Day in Washington, D.C. And
Oh,
studying about it, I learned that in Emancipation, when slaves were freed, there were reparations given to the slave owners to compensate for the loss of slaves, but they only gave money to the slaves if they were willing to go to Haiti or to go to Liberia. If they chose
correct.
to stay in Washington, D.C., they got
They get
absolutely
nothing.
nothing. So slave owners were compensated, but the slaves themselves who had been enforced labor got nothing unless they were willing to leave the area and go to Haiti or to Liberia. And so I think that that's an important piece that we need to understand, that there were reparations for slave owners who lost it, but we didn't do anything to compensate the slaves for the labor that had been beaten out of them over the 100+ years that slavery, almost 200 years that slavery existed in this state, in this country, and that we have to really make up for that as well. This is all economic. The bottom line at the end of the day, when it comes to race and racism, white supremacy in this
It's
country, it's
economic.
all about economics,
It's
and it,
economic.
it can never be separated. Please, people out there want to say it's a class issue. It is not a class issue. It's a race
It's
and a class issue. And it's made a class issue because the rich white folk want to make sure they separate middle class and working class and impoverished white folk from black and brown folk who they have more in common with. Great movements in this country that started out multiracial in many multiracial ways were killed because they knew that if black and brown folk and white folk got together, indigenous folk that were all on the same page and said, wait a minute, all of the issues we have are the same, and we have a common enemy who are rich folk that are trying to continually oppress us. Those movements were killed over and over again
right.
so that uh, we would continually be separated. It's all about economics. At the end of
It
the
is.
day, race and racism is deeply rooted in the economics of this country.
And that's it. And that is all. And that is the absolute truth. We say that, we've read about that, and so we've run out of time. So I have a few comments. First of all, Teresa, thank you for an excellent job of getting those questions communicated. And Reverend Bishop, you just did your thing once again. We will be talking to you some more about some of these issues. And I really think that the education needs to happen. And it really, really, it's going to be very uncomfortable. And the other comment is I am so pleased to see the comments in the chat because I feel that this group of people, and I know some of these group of people, you are truly, truly interested. And so there's some things that Reverend Bishop said that I would say to some of our allies. Look up HB 40, look up SB 40, look up the 1619 Project, look up critical race theory, look up James Hawkins. He, you know who he is, right? He's the slave owner that taught all the other slave owners how to keep the slaves in line. So look up them so you can feel what we feel. We're not just an angry group of people. We have been traumatized, and we just want the truth to be acknowledged, and we want a clear, even playing field. That's all we want. We don't want you to give us anything. We'd like our 40 acres and a mule, but um, that's beside the point. But thank you, especially to our guests. You've been a great audience. You've been participating. This whole program is successful because I can see that our community want to do better. And with the group of us, with educators like Reverend Bishop, coming to our community, talking to us about a very, very difficult topic, we are going to be okay if we can do this all together. So that is my 2 cents. And Bishop, do you have any final words for us so we can close out our program?
Let me just say again, thank you to President Blanding Watson for the invitation to come, and Chairperson Guthridge for your leadership on the economic development team and the NAACP chapter in Lancaster, and Sister Bailey for your leadership on tonight and your facilitating all the questions and everything. Deeply appreciate all of you and look forward to continuing to be an ally in the work for justice in Pennsylvania and beyond. I'm very fond of saying to folk, people ask me why I get up in the morning, and I say, because I'm trying to change the damn world so that my children don't have to wake up feeling like they're living in hell every day. So
Yes.
we're going to continue doing this work, and just appreciate all of you and thank you for the opportunity to be here.
And thank you.
Yes,
And with
thank you
that,
so
I will
much.
say good night, everyone. Have a great evening.